Welcome to Raw and Real. This is number 34, actually, isn't it? Or is it 33? It's number 33.
We forgot to put the little things up.
Yeah. That's all right. I can do
I'll do it
that
right
while we're
now.
talking. Watch this. Watch this. We're just magical. Anyways, I'm M.A. Powers.
And I'm J.L. Powers.
And we're going to assume that if you're listening to this, you probably have followed, because this is kind of in the middle of our talking about religion and writing, but we'll still try and put this in. Is it 33? Or, yeah, 33.
It's 30. Is it 32 or 30? Sorry, it is 30.
33.
It's 33. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi. Does mine say 33 or 34?
I don't know. I can't tell.
Hopefully mine says 33 too.
It says 34, but that's all right.
Here, I'm going to turn it off and turn it back on.
Look at that. We're almost going to say that we are getting a handle on one itty bitty small part of technology. That's huge hubris for me right there, man. Just ask my friend Ken, who I always ask, Ken Culver, about these little things. And I'm sure in the back of his head, he's rolling his eyes because we're talking and I can't see him. He's very nice about it, but I'm sure all I can see if I could see him, all I could see is the whites of his eyes as I ask him about what's a URL, or, what's this thing called Facebook?
Okay, does mine say 33 now? It should, hopefully.
I hope so.
Okay, well, if it doesn't, y'all can just remain confused. So we are continuing the writing and religion, or religion and writing.
Yep. So today I'm going to butt in here because I want you to talk so I get to ask the questions. Woohoo! So we've gotten kind of up into your teen years, and now I want to hear about college, your experience with evangelicalism in college, and your breakaway is really what I want to get to today, is how what really started that breaking away from. I know it's never quick, it's never easy, but I want to hear kind of how that came about and your feelings and just your story about it.
Right. So. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to get to that breakaway without kind of discussing all the things that led up to it. And in college would definitely be a huge part of it. So I went to New Mexico State University. Woohoo, go Aggies. And I started at 16. The first semester, I turned 16. My first semester of college, I was at UTEP. And then in January, I started at NMSU and I moved into the dorms. That first semester at UTEP, I got very involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And this was partly because our older brother, Eric, was also very involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And a big part of college for me at that point was, my friendship with him and really looking to him for, a lot of my kind of social. He had already kind of broken ground and graduated from high school and gone to college and amassed these friendships in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, where I think, he had really struggled through high school to find friendships that meant a lot to him, and he really belonged there. And so I just sort of followed in his footsteps. And in InterVarsity, I very quickly became a small group leader, which is another word for basically leading intense Bible studies. And that first semester that I was at NMSU and I lived in the dorms, and this is really still very hard for me to talk about, and feels like I'm at the confessional, but, I had my first boyfriend, and he happened to be our brother's roommate. And it was a very complicated thing in the sense that, very early on, he started pressuring me to start having sex. And I believe he really cared about me, but he was young and immature. And I didn't want to have sex because of a lot of reasons. One, I believed it was sin. Unless you were married, it was sin. And number two, I just really wasn't emotionally ready. I was 16 years old. I mean, I really was just ready for cuddling and kissing, and maybe not even that emotionally ready for that, although I felt like I was. And I absolutely look at, how Mom definitely talked to me about not being manipulated, not allowing yourself to be manipulated, and the kinds of pressure that you could be under. So it wasn't that I feel like Mom didn't prepare me, but I would say the Christian world as a whole didn't prepare me. She definitely tried to prepare me for that one situation, to not be pressured into something. But nobody talked to me about, the basic message was, you reserve sex for marriage. End of story. If not, it's sin. And there's no other way to look at it. And so nobody really talked to me about, what consent would actually look like, that it's okay to be in a loving relationship outside of marriage and want to have sex, even if you believed that sex should still be reserved for marriage, that was a normal thing and a loving thing, that it wasn't. Now, it wasn't normal and loving in my relationship. My boyfriend was absolutely manipulative and absolutely pressuring me. And, it was hours of pressure and his sort of pretended panic, like, what are we going to do? Like, this just hurts too much to not have sex and blah, 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 and so in my situation, it was absolutely not loving, but I didn't have anybody that I could talk to who could really be honest about, you can be in a very loving relationship and everybody want to have sex, and it's still a loving relationship. And you can also be in a relationship where you're being pressured to have sex, and that's clearly not a loving relationship. It was just, you're in a relationship and you have to save that for marriage, And the lack of nuance and the lack of real understanding meant that, not only was I in a relationship where I wasn't ready to have sex and I was being pressured to have sex, where no was not acceptable, where my no was not allowable, or but that there was nobody that I could talk to honestly. I did go to a woman in my history class, but her response was just, sex is wonderful. And oh my gosh, and you're in your first relationship and you guys love each other. And even there, I couldn't, from that kind of secular counterpoint, there was nobody that would be like, it's okay not to be ready. Right. If you're not consenting and if you don't want it, it's not consent. I didn't have it. I went to her because I knew she wasn't going to just give me you just got to wait until marriage. But I also really needed somebody to offer me a holistic understanding of relationships, Well,
and I think, this is not just the Christian culture. I think it was the culture in general, especially, up until pretty recently. And that's the idea that, no means no. And if you're uncomfortable, that's not yes. Has not been historically taught. That,
no.
Our culture has been kind of like, almost like you should want this to the point where you can't control yourself, basically. And so
sex is everything.
Right.
Our value as humans is largely determined by whether we feel like we're sexually desirable. This is the message that is sent to us.
Sure. Yeah.
And certainly from that kind of secular counterpoint, there was no message of it can be very valuable to just wait. It can be valuable to be in a romantic relationship and not have sex. It can be valuable to, wait until you're ready. That wasn't a message that was being sent.
Well, and I think, that comes back to our, this was just starting of the huge purity movement, so we were kind of at the very beginning cusp of it, or we were pretty far into the purity movement, but it got a lot worse. I don't know if it's gotten better because we're not involved in the evangelical Christian, world, but that whole idea about sex being, it was like, we're consumed with sex and you shouldn't have it, kind of, until you're married, and it's like the worst sin in the world, and like, I don't know how many people will get a complex, but we don't care because we're not going to teach you about it except not to have it. And then when you get married and you're struggling, then it's just, because there's been no I don't know, it just there's been no holistic idea of like, this is good and this is fun, and you should do it when you're ready, and no means no, and you don't have to do it now, you can do it a lot later. But
well, I was caught in this very awkward place where there was no set of culture anywhere offering me what I actually needed. So on the one hand, I couldn't talk to Christians about it because it would just be like, what? Okay, your relationship is sinful. You need to get out, break up with him, which I did need to do that. But I also didn't,
maybe for different reasons, not because it was sinful necessarily, but you needed to break up because it was a manipulative relationship.
Exactly.
And having the clarity to see that. And I think that's where things get off base sometimes within the culture we grew up in, was not doing the right thing for really messed up internal reasons that weren't helpful to us as people, right? Still doing the right thing, but maybe not doing it, but doing it for like really oddball, weird reasons.
Right. Well, becoming sexually involved in a relationship where I really didn't ever give consent, and he knew it, but that was deeply, deeply wounding to me. But the only way I knew how to deal with it was confession of sin, right? And so ultimately, that's what happened. Ultimately, I managed to break up with him, and then I started telling people, but it was all within this context of confession of sin. It was not, geez, I was emotionally and physically manipulated to have sex with somebody that I didn't want to have sex with, that I never wanted to have sex with, that he knew I didn't want to have sex with him. That for, and that there was nowhere where I could go to talk about that. I mean, literally nowhere to go to talk about that. The only understanding and the only framework that was offered to me to understand what I had experienced was sin. Not his sin. Mine. And so, I spent my second year of college, the year I was 17, just, kind of on my knees, literally like begging God. I mean, I felt that God forgave me. It wasn't that, but just begging for healing. Like it was this, I was so devastated. And I talked to a variety of people about it, but again, it was all in the confession of, or it was all in that sense of confession. And I cried and people were very like forgiving of my sin, except some people weren't. I mean, there was, but that gets into more details than I want to, but there certainly was some serious repercussions for me out of that, but it did. And it definitely propelled me into, very strongly being a Christian and an evangelical Christian and understanding the world in that context and in that culture. And so I think that was really the time period where I really embraced it in many ways for myself. But again, how real is that? You know, if I first embraced it because I was terrified of demons and needed to make a public declaration, and then secondly, I felt like my sin was so great when in fact it wasn't my sin at all, you know. Those were the sort of, I think, two propelling things that really propelled me into embracing this on my own. And so then I was just full on, you know. I was very involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I went on a missions trip the summer I turned 19.
Yeah.
And that was with Africa Inland Mission, and I worked with street youth in Kenya.
Uh-huh.
And the interesting thing about that missions trip was that wasn't a going out and telling people about Jesus kind of missions trip at all. Right. Actually, that was a, you know, I'm working with street kids to get them food and water and shelter, and which is a very different kind of mission experience than, you know, trying to convert people to Jesus. And it was a very kind of profoundly moving time for me. I mean, I certainly felt that summer that I was probably called to be a missionary long term. And I felt like, you know, I was called to work with the poor and all of these things. And definitely that was probably the summer that propelled me into, you know, today. I have 2 master's degrees in African history. I, you know, have a publishing company where I publish African writers. You know, I'm sure like that it all links back to that time. But so and that summer too, I think I began to grapple a little bit more with the pain that I had felt of being sexually abused as a child by the boys in my class. And I started grappling with the repercussions of some of that. My relationship with my best friend, who also went to Kenya, fell apart. And we're fine now. In fact, she's still my best friend now, but there were several years, our relationship fell apart, and there were several years where we didn't talk to each other. Not because we were like keeping it, we just like, it was just too painful. We were in such pain over the way our relationship fell apart that, and we don't even understand why to this day, but when I went back after that, you know, my relationship with InterVarsity was honestly never the same, because my best friend was in InterVarsity. She was the new president of the chapter, and we were in such pain and agony as our relationship was falling apart. And it felt like a lot of my relationships at that time were falling apart in the organization that I was involved with. And I can't really explain all of that except to say that, you know, when you invest all of your time and energy and relationships in one organization and then they start falling apart, right? It kind of makes you realize that how isolated you are.
Right. No, for sure. And I mean, but it's on purpose.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It's totally on purpose. And I think that that's what's so devastating a lot of times, is when you start to feel cracks in this culture, but it's all consuming, how lonely it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, I felt very much that I shouldn't be talking to anybody about the difficulties in my relationship with my best friend. And I think she was very careful too, but she did talk to one mutual friend of ours. And then that relationship started falling apart because that friend, you know, started taking, you know, my best friend's side. And like, I was like, what's going on? I just felt horrible, shitty for the rest of my college career. I graduated. I literally left InterVarsity, and it was at that point that I started going to Youth with a Mission, and
Right.
King's Kids.
Right.
Actually, it wasn't that year, but it was the next summer, prior to my last semester in college. The next summer, I started working with King's Kids, with Youth with a Mission,
Right.
in large part because I didn't, you know, it was a safe place. It was Christian, and it was a safe place away from the kind of devastation of these relationships that.
Sure, but remembering this though too, there was always tension within that culture because, you believed and we believe kind of more that like women can be real leaders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's always tension when you get into the evangelical culture and you are a leader and you're a woman. I remember that. I don't know. I felt like there was a lot of tension there because I was, I saw it
Right.
and I didn't like it. I didn't blame you at all.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Now I'm curious what you mean. Like,
well, because you already, when you were in college already, you were already from the outside perspective, you already were obtaining non-orthodoxy viewpoints, just straight up, like the idea that like why would and part of it is the grappling with what you were grappling with, and I had never really, looking back on it, I see it now, but at the time, I was 2.5 years younger, and I was like, I don't know. I mean, sin is sin, right? And you were like, but is sexual sin any worse than any other sin? Which, if you look at the Bible, there isn't any difference. There just isn't, like, right? And so, but we have this within our culture, this viewpoint that somehow sexual sin is so devastatingly awful that it'll just completely destroy everybody's life if you're involved in it. And it has emotional nuances that other sins don't. So it is true that it can really mess up your life, but as a sin, just as a straight up sin, not any worse than gluttony. I mean, right. Gluttony is a sin. Sexual sin is a sin. You're not going to get pregnant from gluttony. And I think that's the other thing. Like, historically, people would get pregnant, right? And things got really messy and ugly. So historically, yeah, I could see that sexual sin could be culturally viewed as being this difficult thing to deal with. But in terms of spirituality, like, if you look at it, sin is sin, right? There's no, right. It's not any worse than cursing. So
right.
It's not any better, it's not any worse. So you already were asking those questions, right? And
I was. Also,
you were asking those questions, and they were good. They made people think about it, and those are good questions to think about. And then and this gets back to that purity culture thing, because it was flying in the face of things that people taught, which was stupid ass stuff, like okay, if you're a virgin, you're like this tube of toothpaste, and then if you have sex and then they squeeze all the toothpaste, you can't get the toothpaste back in. Now you have this, awful, like, mangled tube of toothpaste. And I'm like, we could say that about, and I started thinking that in my head too. I'm like, well, we could say that about anything. Like, here's this tube of toothpaste, you just ate, 4 rolls from Golden Corral, which was, everybody went to Golden Corral and stuffed their faces silly, and you squeeze the tube out, and now you're this awful, sinful person. You can't get those, those rolls have now made you an awful, terrible person. Like, I don't know, you could do that about anything, but they didn't. It was only about sexual purity, right?
Well, it's interesting to hear, and I actually want to hear more about that.
Because
when I went to YWAM and King's Kids, you were involved already. Right. And so in one sense, I was horning in on your territory. I don't know if you felt that way.
No,
maybe
I didn't really care.
But in a way I was, but because I was fleeing from this other place that had become completely devastatingly unsafe for me.
Which is funny. Yeah, and the world goes round and round, because I started in YWAM and ended up in InterVarsity afterwards, like
Right.
we did it the other way around. But that's a whole nother, that is another story. So anyways, so we started seeing these cracks. You flew to the YWAM and you actually went on a DTS at some point, right?
Yeah. So I started working with the local Youth with a Mission, which had a King's Kids chapter. And King's Kids, you can talk about it way more than I could, but it, right. It's this organization that within Youth with a Mission that right. Uses children to spread the gospel, right?
Right.
And I absolutely think that it uses children to spread the gospel. Right. Like, there are a lot of people out there that might get angry with me for saying it that way, but that's how I view it. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. And I went on several, short-term missions trips with them. And then I graduated from college. Oh, I went on one short-term missions trip. And then I graduated from college and I went on a discipleship training school 6-month thing with Youth with a Mission. But before, I will say, like you were saying that, I was coming up with some questions.
Right.
And, among those questions definitely had to do with the place of women in the church.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
And the place of LGBTQ people in the church. Now, for me, the women issue is very personal. I, was deeply disturbed by what seemed like real inequality in relationships. And I began to recognize that there were real problems with telling women to submit to male authority in their relationships, even when the male was wrong, but that was the way God had ordained it. So you were doing what you were supposed to do by submitting, even when the male was wrong. And and I had deep problems with this. I was reading books from an evangelical perspective about this, trying to like grapple with it from within the culture and come up with answers that would allow me to remain in the culture. And so I was asking some of those questions, and people really didn't respond well.
Right, I can imagine.
And we'll come back to that. But
yeah, no, I remember you asking those questions and kind of just, at the time just being like, yeah, but that's just, we have different roles, but like they're equal. They're just different, which is like stupid, right? That's like, yeah, that's like being like, well, the president of the United States and my role are equal. They're different, but they're equal. They're just not. They're not. They just physically they aren't. Like what I decide won't kill. Won't accidentally kill a million people. So yeah, it just isn't
right. Well, I found it profoundly upsetting that this whole idea that women in the church had to submit to male leadership and that wives had to submit to their husbands.
No.
So I started asking those questions, and I went, and we'll return to that because those had some real repercussions for me with Youth with a Mission later. But first I went on my discipleship training school. I went to Australia. And then and the way DTS is structured, for those of you that have not ever gone with Youth with a Mission, also known as YWAM, is it's a 6-month training period that allows you then to go on and be a full-time missionary with Youth with a Mission. And you have spent 3 months in school where you're being kind of trained in the evangelical imperatives of the missionary endeavor, and also specifically in kind of charismatic theology. And charismatic theology would be, more visible manifestations of God, like
that God is ever present right here he gets
healing.
he intervenes in our daily lives all the time and can produce miracles, and we see it through miracles and speaking in tongues and worship and however you want to do it. Yep.
Right. And you know, cracks really started showing up for me at that point because for a number of reasons. I mean, the teachings felt very, very heavy and problematic. You know, certainly there were parts of it that were kind of enjoyable. You know, I fell over in the Spirit several times, which I found to be this immensely peaceful thing, like just lying there was kind of like a little nap, not dissimilar to later on when I went through acupuncture and basically took a nap on the it was sort of similar, like just this sort of peaceful time where I could just kind of lie there.
That's funny because I always got freaked out by being slain in the Spirit, as they said, and I was like gonna have no part of it. I was like, not that, like it either happens. I'm not open to this. Like, it has to be a miracle for it to be happening to me, because I'm just not open to it. I'm not going to fall over. There's no way. Like, that's just like, that's giving over control, and I'm not I'm not there. And when I saw other people, like whole congregations of people going over, I was just like, this is too weird for me. I'm out of here, man. I had to leave the building because I was like, I don't know what's going on in there. But it has, like, falling over and laying on the ground has nothing to do with God. Like as far as I can tell, like, it can, sure, maybe, but like there's nothing about being slain in the Spirit that has any, like, anything except cultural.
Right.
It's a cultural thing.
Well,
move on.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, it didn't happen to me very often, but it happened a few times, and I just found it kind of peaceful just to lie there and have a conversation with God in my head, you know.
Good times. Good times.
Good times, yes. But I found so many other elements to be so problematic there. Sure. For one thing, you know, there was a very, very strong, clear
anti-intellectualism.
Anti-intellectualism, yes. Okay. Well, the first thing I was going to say was there was a very strong prejudice against fat, against the sort of, you know, gluttony and this lack of. Now, a lot of people were overweight, but it was during that time that I kind of developed some of my really unhealthy ideas about that following God meant being a soldier, and being a soldier meant being fit physically, and that meant being thin. And so I developed a borderline eating disorder that plagued me for a few years after that. It never developed into actual eating disorder, but it was borderline, definitely. I was really restricting my caloric intake, and because I needed to be thin. And that developed as a result of Youth with a Mission and DTS.
Yes.
And then the anti-intellectualism was deeply disturbing to me. I had a college degree, and I remember it being in India one night. So among the other things that happened, like we're in India, and the people on my DTS are preaching, because every night you would go places and you'd do these skits where you would basically introduce the idea that, you know, man had fallen in the Garden of Eden, had disobeyed God by eating fruit from a tree. And this has caused, you know, mankind to be forever, you know, separated from God. And that was why Jesus had to come and die on the cross, and so that we could be forgiven for our sins and reunited with God. And so this was the basic message of every play that we did, or skit that we were doing all over India. And I remember sitting there. There were a number of things that happened. One is that we were praying for people all the time, and, you know, in the name of Jesus, I cast demons out from you, or I pray that you be healed from this, because people would come forward and ask to be healed for something. And I never saw anyone get healed. Okay. Right. And I would ask, I'd be like, do you feel better? Because they'd come forward for prayers for headaches or whatever. They probably felt sorry for us. Let me go forward. I have a headache. Pray for me. And I'd be like, is your headache better? And they'd go like this and walk away. And it was like, okay, maybe,
Right.
but I never saw anybody get healed. Certainly nothing dramatic.
Right.
And I never saw any demons cast out of anybody either. And I remember sitting there and listening to one of my team members, or night after night, listening to my team members preach and tell the story of, Adam and Eve eating this apple and that they weren't supposed to eat. And sitting there going, I don't think I think about this story the same way you do. Like, I don't see this as a literal apple and a literal tree and a literal garden. And you do. And you can't fathom any other way to see it. And I don't think I fully am on board here with what we're doing. But
yeah.
And then one night, all these kids came up. We were at a church, and all these kids came up and wanted to be prayed for so that they would do well in school. And that night, after the kids left, we were in the church, and our DTS leader wanted us to pray for two things. One, he was really disturbed by this was an Indian Orthodox church, and Indian Christianity has been around for a really long time, and the tradition places Thomas, one of the early disciples, going there and converting Indians. And they had developed, a strong kind of Orthodox type of Christianity where there's pictures of saints and crosses and things like that. And well, this was the sin of iconography, right?
Okay.
And that had to be prayed against. And then go ahead. And yes, you may. Yes. And then the second thing that he was really angry about was that these kids were coming up and asking for prayer to do well in school. And this was the demon of intellectualism, and we needed to pray against that. And I just sat there. I didn't pray because I thought, this is wrong. Like, I don't agree. These kids want to do well in school. What's wrong with that? And so those were some of the early cracks. And then I was definitely running into men who just absolutely were telling me that it didn't matter if I knew that I was smarter than some random man out there, any man that I met, even if I thought that I was smarter than them, I wasn't. And I wasn't equal. Like, I was having arguments with men in YWAM about this and just being like, not all of them. A lot of the men didn't have that kind of attitude, but I was running into plenty who did, who were just, definitely would insist that physically, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually, I was subservient to men simply because I was a woman. And I just couldn't take that. And you wanted to insert a question or something about the Adam and Eve and
later. That's way back. Keep going.
Okay. So then when I came home, I spent a year full-time with Youth with a Mission in El Paso, and working specifically with King's kids. And then I started graduate school. And during that year with Youth with a Mission, this issue of women in the church was such a huge thing for me. And I encountered some real problems. I remember, being disturbed where, men would come in and interrupt their wives who were doing work to ask them to fix them a sandwich or something. I was like, can't you get your own damn sandwich? Your wife is working hard here. She's doing something else. You're not doing anything. You're in the other room watching TV. Or other little things like that. And I remember one of the leaders one time saying disparagingly to people, well, Jessica's the Christian version of feminist, And that same person got really, really angry with me when I talked with her daughter about this issue of, women being subservient to their husbands and how I struggled with that. And so rumors started to fly. I heard later that I was actually a lesbian, and and demonic.
Good times.
So yeah, a couple of the leaders were spreading those rumors, and when one of them admitted it to me, she was really angry with me.
Oh yeah.
And admitted that, yeah, those were rumors going around that she had helped to spread. And she didn't seem to realize that she was spreading rumors about me.
Right.
Because she was just so angry with me that I was questioning these things.
Right.
And so what I got, I guess, was deserved, you know? Right. I don't know. But those were just those kind of cracks that came in that were like, you know,
when you don't
I don't fit here.
Right. Well,
you guys don't want me.
Right. Because when you outgrow that's the problem, is you outgrow a culture. Right.
Yeah.
But the culture is much more static. It grows, but so much slower. A culture will grow so much slower than an individual, because it only changes when a critical amount of individuals change.
It's just hilarious to me in retrospect that, like, clearly if you had, you know, some inclinations that women might be equal to men, then you must be a lesbian.
Right. Well, of course, right? I mean, one sin deserves another, right?
Right. And demonic.
Right, of course. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, everything was demonic. It was like, gets a little crazy after a while, you know, and like, yeah, if anything that doesn't go with your cultural view of things then becomes demonic, just like you're saying, like the iconography becomes demonic, you know, because these people have icons within their church and that's not part of your culture, right?
Right.
Or, you know, this person isn't acting like I want them to, so they must be demonic.
Right.
Instead of having a conversation about it. So, you know.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know.
Well, the problem is because intellectual conversations are difficult because they challenge people's point of view to the point where they feel uncomfortable and like, what if this one little aspect of my culture is wrong? Then everything could be wrong. Like, whoa, no, you know. And so we all struggle with that. We all struggle with it.
We do. And I mean, I certainly see that these days in the political spectrum where people just at when any kind of minor point of their overall worldview or political viewpoint is questioned. It's like, you know, if you disagree with me on this tiny point over here, then, you know, it's not on the same page. And I'm seeing that in an entirely secular context, right?
Right. No, totally.
It's like, oh my gosh, you know, it's very similar to some of my experiences with evangelicalism, but in an entirely secular context. Sure. And it's disturbing to me. It's like, okay.
And I think
adoptions occur in all sorts of
contexts. Right. And I think that's what's some of the cracks within and start the struggles I have is that idea that whenever we, including in myself, but mainly, of course, other people, because I don't have this problem, but I think you're frozen. All right, well, we're going to stop here because we've lost Jessica, and we will continue this conversation again later. All right, bye.